Welcome to Let's Talk Global Business, the show in which we look at the economic and business trends connecting the world. I'm Sarah Murray, Managing Director International at the Conference Board, the member-led global think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Today, we're looking at the growing pressure on CEOs to navigate social and political expectations. Communications that once felt straightforward now carry wider meaning, and leaders are being watched more closely by employees, customers, and the public. As reactions move faster and issues become more polarized, the stakes for what companies say and what they choose not to say has never been higher. Joining me today is Su Simha, Global Marketing and Brand Strategist, Fractional CMO and former CMO of Ecosia, with leadership roots at Microsoft, Bombardier and N26. And Jan Botts, Global Communicator and Programme Director for the Internal Communications Council at the Conference Board. Welcome both. So to kick things off, I'm going to ask you both a simple question. Should CEOs speak out on social issues? Jan, do you want to start?
Yes and no. It's not, I don't believe this is either or. It's both and kind of question, kind of answer. It just depends on so many factors that I know we'll be talking about, but there's no one answer which makes this challenging.
And Sue?
Well, I have to agree with John there, but I will say something here that I do believe CEOs should speak out. And controversial, I'm going to say that yes, they should, but only when the issue is part of the company brand values and priority to its audience. So, not everything and not necessarily on trending topics. I believe in today's world, silence can be interpreted as a stance, and speaking up can instantly become political. So, the question isn't should we speak, but when, why, on what basis. So I think we'll touch more on this today. So definitely something I'm looking forward to. Thank you.
Great. What would you say has changed recently that makes business communication feel so closely watched, Sue?
I think there are three things, speed, scrutiny, and fragmentation. Social issues are moving at the speed of social media, as we can all see, and employees are expecting their companies to have a voice, and global audiences across the world, or audiences even in local regions, react differently to the message that may be perceived differently in other regions. So as a marketer, I have felt the shift from controlled messaging, which used to be the case, let's say 10, 15 years ago, to an environment where every word travels instantly and is looked at with a much deeper lens and political and cultural filters.
Jan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would say that a lot changed with COVID, like so many things. Particularly, I deal with employee communicators most of the time, and when it came to the expectations of CEOs and the transparency and honesty and empathy that was expected by employees, I think that raised expectations in general of leaders and their employers. I think that was a real tipping point in terms of increased expectations and all the things that Sue said as well, the faster pace, the complicated landscape we operate in today.
And would you say that's the reason that the pressure from customers, employees, and politics and media has shifted, or there was something else as well?
So I believe that yes, there is a lot of pressure, and I think employees, the expectations from employees are increasing as we see, and I think customers are expecting clarity or a stance, and of course, external actors like media, politicians, or even advocacy groups, they expect responses to be taken instantly or sort of coming instantly, and I think this tension comes from the fact that these expectations are often contradicting each other. What employees may expect may not be what the media is expecting. And I think, for example, what reassures employees in Berlin might upset customers in Texas, for example, or regulators in Asia. So the contradiction is what I think is really causing a very unique kind of pressure.
Jan?
I think the issue of trust plays a role here in terms of expectations of our stakeholders, because a lot of research is showing that trust in traditional institutions is waning, to say the least. And trust in business is where we've seen a pretty steady, if not even uplifting in trust. So that comes with responsibility. Um, and there's just this hyper focus on business now, in
Mhm.
part because of that, in part because employees do have these elevated expectations,
Mhm.
not just on my work, but on my life. How do you feel about these issues that are affecting me as a person? I'm more than an employee. So I think that's part of it. And I think to your point about what do you do? I think it's listening, very close listening, whether it's customers, the community, politicians, investors, employees, of course. I think we really have to keep close watch on what's going on in media, in customer response, in exit interviews with employees. What is it that is feeding all this change?
Mm. From your own experience, Sue, when have you felt this shift most clearly as a communicator or marketeer?
That's a very good question because I think I've seen that, spanning 2 decades now. So I would say at Microsoft and Bombardier, for example, or even back at Microsoft back, many years ago, I would say that, global teams, meant we were constantly balancing regional, kind of issues and sensitivities. But at Ecosia, for example, we operate in a very purpose-driven space, and even positive action sometimes could be interpreted through geopolitical lenses. So, for example, what may work for US may not work in Germany, for example. And that sort of contrast exists. And this shift has been really stressful. I would say that we cannot land with one message, realizing that there's no one single message and it doesn't land the same everywhere has been the biggest shift. And so being super
Mhm.
super structured and planned, how you're going to back up your claims or your statements, and what exactly does it mean to your employees, partners, and customers in a different region. I think there's some really great examples of the backlashes we have seen recently. So I think that we can touch on that a little later, but I would say that that is the biggest shift, is to make sure that there's no backlash,
Mm.
most importantly.
Mhm. Mhm.
And Jan, obviously within your council that you lead, and how have you seen this within the member companies?
Mhm. Mhm. What I've seen is the need for communicators to develop more business skills. Even, and we've talked about this for a long time, that it's always helpful if a communicator has a business view, but even more so now because the C-suite is relying on the advice of senior communicators, and you have to understand their business. And coupled with that, then I think is a need for a more horizontal view, kind of like what Sue was saying. You have to know what's going on globally if you're a global company, your audiences, how they interact, um, what's going on at the front line level, as well as middle management is another whole topic we could talk about, and the need for middle management leaders to be the carriers of the corporate message and the corporate brand. But I just see this continuing need for communicators to have to become business people. And then, of course, technology plays into that as well. We don't do paper newsletters anymore. And, following social, understanding data analytics, the skills that communicators are needing to develop are very different. And AI is another obvious factor there too. So it's it's just a lot going on in the profession right now.
Mm. It just sounds like that pressure equation. It's not just bigger. It's it's less predictable, and I think that kind of brings us nicely onto our next section about the
Mhm.
consequences when CEOs do speak. So, as a communications leader, how do you think about the balance between the risks and the opportunities of speaking up on a social issue?
That's actually a very, very good question, because I think this is the biggest challenge on the table for most leaders and even the comms team, the PR teams. And I think speaking up is worth it when the issue is directly connected to your business, your values. Your employees do expect a stance, and you can support the message, with real decisions like policies, donations, or product changes, or adding things to the roadmap. And I think to some extent, the CEO also should accept that some audiences may walk away, that you may lose some customers, and it is an intentional trade off and should not be a surprise. I think it is too risky when you're reacting emotionally to headlines and have no real track record on the topic, or it's a topic of interest for the founder or the CEO, acting out of impulse, without considering the brand or the rest of the company. I think that's where is the bigger challenge. So I think you really have to weigh in whether it's worth it to speak about this topic, whether this topic relates to your brand, values of your company, values of your employees and your audience, or whether it is simply just a passing trend that you just want to latch on as sort of a promotional tactic. And that's, I think, a very important. And I would definitely say that often it is a combination of things that people need to keep in mind, and it's not one person's decision. So multiple departments need to come together. So I'll touch more on that in a later topic, but this is, I think, the key is to understand the balance between the risk and the opportunity there.
Yeah. Jan, anything you want to add?
Yes, I've seen with my members a definite pullback from automatically speaking. I think companies were burned. I think there has been backlash for speaking too soon, and in cases when it wasn't particularly relevant. I think, Sue, you hit the nail on the head when you said sometimes it's the CEO who has a passion for a topic, but it doesn't really relate to the business, or even the values that drive the business. So I think that's really important. And so what I've seen in our councils is on things like some of the global conflicts that we've had, there are messages to employees about opportunities available for them if they have issues they need to talk out, if they have family issues related to a global conflict or what have you. So it's definitely an internal message, knowing that it will be public, of course, but it's geared toward employees, and companies are doing less of taking a stand one way or the other and more about how do we support employees. And I think that's partly because of the learning that just having an opinion and expressing it isn't the way to go.
You're reminding me that kind of silence can become a statement in itself now, really, which is a very different environment from even 5 years ago. So if we think about recent examples where messages were misunderstood or created, a backlash, what would you say the learnings are?
Oh my goodness, so many recently. So I think if you think about it, we have had last 3 years being so politically heavy, and I think this has been. I would say it's going to be a case study for most business schools and comms schools, I would say, to some extent. So let's take the most recent example. For example, the McDonald's story and the Israel-Gaza boycotts. I think the local support for Israeli soldiers from the McDonald's in the local region led to boycotts in Muslim majority markets. And that resulted in a massive, massive drop for the company profits and revenues. I think the CEO later did say the firm had no position and acknowledged it, that as a meaningful hit to the business. But I think the biggest lesson that we can learn is that local actions that are taken without consideration or without actually alignment with the global teams and global, or maybe they did align and they didn't think it was going to be a big deal, can really become a global stance. And people are not looking at the action of one local region as a local action anymore. And I think saying we are neutral after actions rarely convinces anyone, who's watching. And I think you could really, end up in really bad situations. I think what I would say the biggest lesson is making sure that your local entities, your global entities, your partners, and everyone associated together are truly aligned, and not to treat any decision in pockets. I think that's the biggest lesson from my experience, and also from what I've seen recently.
Mhm, mhm.
It's really interesting because as I'm listening to you both, it's almost like misrepresentation feels almost inevitable now because issues are jumping cultural boundaries instantly. And it really is something that leaders are struggling with and will continue to do so, given how
Yeah.
quickly you can access information as well. So it's a very, very tricky situation, which again brings me to my big point. To handle the fact that different countries have very different cultural and ethical expectations, do you see that there is an example of best in class? There's a certain company that has dealt with that very well.
I have a number of companies on my council that are global, and the ones that are most successful are those who have an established network of in-country communications people, and
Mm.
whether that's the senior administrative person for the country manager, or you know, a full-time communicator or part-time, but they have a network and they communicate before the crisis. So they talk about the plans, they talk about how we're going to issue messages, they talk about the process. Because everyone knows that, I was going to say this before, the story is going to live until you provide clarity.
When do you think staying quiet actually creates more problems than saying something? Sue?
I think definitely I have to concur also with Jan earlier when she talked about, sort of pre planning. I think, this is, I think, one of the best ways, to avoid silence as well to some extent. I think, so you're not caught off guard trying to figure out whether we should be quiet or whether we should speak about it. I think she nailed it, said it very well about, having a plan in place in advance. I think silence is really dangerous when, in my opinion, when the issue affects your employees, most importantly, or customers. And I think the biggest mirror is the values. So for example, a simple rule of thumb in my experience is, if your own people are already asking loudly, where are you on this, staying quiet usually does more damage to trust than saying something. And if the issue is only related to your business, I think pressure to say something, sometimes people tend to think, oh, it's related to our business, so we should say something. But it can often be responded with an action than just simply statements, behind, so do something about it. So I think, to tie it all together, I would say a simple 4-question framework that I have always guided previous companies in is: number one, is this the right issue? Is this linked to our mission, our people, or operations, or versus, or is it just a generally trending or a generic topic, in that sense? Is it the right voice? Is this a
Right.
CEO moment? Is it a company level operational action, or better handled by, let's say, local leaders or partners? Number 3 is really, is it the right commitment? Can we back it with the words, with the budget, let's say policy or product decisions or roadmap, plans? And do we have the right, readiness, or preparedness? Have we mapped what could be the potential backlash scenarios and agreed where we will toe the line, and how can global local tensions escalate and how we'll handle it? So for example, when I talked about McDonald's, I think these 4 questions of right issue, right voice, right commitment, and right readiness, I think if this is kept in your framework at all times in companies with pre-planning, like what Jan said, I think this could really, really help them a lot. So silence does not need to be so much of a last minute decision, but rather, a well thought and a well agreed, aligned thought on that, or a decision from the company and the different departments.
Mm.
Yeah. I would emphasize that point, Sue, of um, linking messaging with action. And if you can't do that, then maybe you shouldn't be talking so much, right?
No.
And I think even if you choose to quote unquote silent externally, helping employees understand why you're saying silent is still important. And because it could just be, and in the U.S. vernacular, we don't have a dog in that hunt. It's not our business. It's not our issue. We don't have operations in that area, whatever it is. But explaining why is really helpful. And if that gets out beyond the employee, so be it. That's fine.
Mm.
It's people just need to understand. And then over time, they become more educated and more in tune with why we might speak or not.
Mm.
So it's an education thing in a way.
Very true. Very true.
Sue, when a message backfires,
Mhm.
who should a company speak to first? Employees, customers, or the wider public?
I always say, as a rule, employees first,
Mm-hmm.
then your customers, and not all customers, but key customers whom you're close to. If it's a B2B company, I'm sure you have a set of customers in your executive, round table, or whomever you're closely connected with. I think those key customers, you could have a sounding board there. And
Mm-hmm.
partners, these are the most important. Of course, then the wider public. So if your own people, like what Jan said earlier, if your own people are confused or blindsided, what they will end up doing is filling the gap on LinkedIn, X, or in, Instagram or Twitter, and which makes the situation harder to control. I think internally you need to acknowledge what happened, share what you know and don't know yet, and you have to give clear guidance on, when, what they can say and where to escalate questions. So I think the most important thing is employees. This is clearly
Yeah.
my experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Same, Jan?
I agree 100%. I
Yeah.
can't add anything to what you said.
Yeah. No, but I'm hearing the same, that more leaders say that employees are their first audience, because if you lose them, the external message won't matter. Um, and what do you think are the most important steps for rebuilding credibility after a crisis, Jan?
We kind of hit on this idea of linking actions and message. I think you have to have clarity of message, clarity of actions, step up. Yeah, as soon as you take responsibility, you can move on. If a mistake was made,
Mm-hmm.
or if you're culpable in some way, and that's hard to do, but it's so obvious. And don't it goes without saying, don't try to blame, don't try to cover up, step up and then move on. Here's what we're going to do. And I think people really appreciate that. I think that's absolutely critical. If you're not transparent and clear and consistent, is my other thing here, because you can't say something today and something else tomorrow. So you have to think through and then commit to what you're going to do or not do, if that's the case. And again, you start with employees, and then to the other stakeholders. And this all happens very quickly. It's not like you wait a week before before you go out to other audiences. It's probably all in the same day, but you start with your employees.
Interesting. So the companies that recover the fastest are the ones that admit what went wrong early, even if the full picture isn't complete yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you say, like as Sue said, you say what you can say, and
Yeah.
sometimes there are regulatory issues. You can't speak. And that makes then explain that. I
Mm.
mean, so let people understand why we can't give you more detail. We have a lot of healthcare companies and financial companies on our council. They're highly regulated, so there are things they can't say depending on the crisis, but explain that.
Mm.
And again, help educate people as to the why. If they understand the why, you can build credibility, and it just helps people move on.
Mm.
Indeed, I'll just add one other thing. I think Jan said exactly the things that you should do, absolutely, actions, actions, actions. I would say that most importantly. And I think there's something else I observed is, coming from a background of corporate to startups, and, what I have seen in my career is, I think what doesn't cut it is passive language. There's no point in being passive and using, we regret, regrettable situations, or no hiding. I think I would say my advice to most companies who are young, who are not, having that much of a pressure of, having to do multiple legal checks before what they say. I think the rule of thumb is to be super simple, keep it simple in what you're saying, be straightforward, say what went wrong, who was affected, what are you changing. So I think using human language, human,
Yes.
level, I think, rather than legal language or trying to, somewhat cover it up with, this passive language, is what is really, really important, is, being super
Yeah.
straightforward, honest, and coming across as a person and not as
Yes.
10,000 people company. That's important, no matter, of course, no matter what size you are. I would still
Mhm.
say that, but I think especially for younger companies, it's super important to be
Mhm.
honest and straightforward. So
Mm. And just building on that, how, because we talked about it earlier as well, how can CEOs make sure then that the brand, the comms, the legal, the HR, all of the teams are
Uh-huh.
aligned before anything goes out? Just to your point, one might say we need to be very human in our language, another might say, well, we need a more legalistic language. So how do you get that alignment before anything goes out? And you have to do it very quickly.
I have a lot to say about this because it is the bane of the communicator's existence to have to go through legal with
Yeah.
every statement. And again, in highly regulated industries, it's the way it is. So I think what's key is to have the relationship with these other functions, the legal, HR, manufacturing, whatever the relevant functions are, and work together on the process.
Mm-hmm.
Here's how we're going to do it. And one of the key things is what we frustrated me so much when I was in this role. Everybody had to say yes, but one person could say no. And then you start over. So, be really clear who has the veto power.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, we would get and I was in a B2B, engineering based company. So, the detail was it was just, sometimes we just were ground to a halt. This was long enough ago that, it kind of it wasn't today's landscape of media. But you can't do that now. So work ahead of time. Most companies have risk committees or risk assessments, but I think we document a process with these key functions on who has, and it can't always be the CEO. The CEO might be
Mm.
unavailable, so you
or
you
might be wrong.
yeah, it might be dead wrong. Exactly. So being able to speak truth to power is another issue here. But um, so often it was, in our case, it was legal that bogged us down because they would wordsmith messaging and it just, so anyway, that's, I'm on my high horse here, but I think you build the relationship and have a process.
Mm-hmm. Sue, anything you want to add?
Yes, I think I would like to. I mean, Jan said everything that I would have probably said earlier as well. I think the important thing for what I have seen is, besides alignment, which I think is super crucial, and often what happens is that departments operate in silos. So, for example, if it's a crisis situation, PR tends to operate on its own, with the agencies, and they don't keep into consideration the comms or the brand, and they are working on their own with the legal. HR is not involved in some cases, and this is where really things start breaking. Like what Jan said, making sure that all the stakeholders have brought in is really important. At the same time, knowing who is the person in charge, that's super clear. I think I would say, end of the day, when it comes to crisis comms, PR leads the way. I would say even brand may have a different perspective, if legal and PR always have the higher authority in that sense. But most importantly, I would say especially the leaders involved here, like CEOs or the C-level execs. I think the most important thing here is to not be emotional, to not escalate emotionally. I think crisis communication, in my experience, over 20 plus years, I would say, has to be really slow, clear,
Yeah.
and more thoughtful than the crisis itself. So, while you need to respond quickly within 24 hours or less than that, a calm mind, a composed perspective. I think that's going to rule any sort of damage that could potentially happen. And please never outsource judgment. I would say, to, let's say, an agency whom you're working with to make the decision on it. End of the day, this is the accountability of the company, of the brand, of the values of that organization. So this is super important that that this is taken internally in the company as a decision and not simply led by pressure. And most importantly, like what Jan said, a values framework is what is needed here, not a feed, not a X feed or not Facebook feed. I think this is really crucial. I think so. Most importantly, what I have always done in the past is to have some sort of mapping, values and risk mapping. So that sort of helps a lot to avoid making a situation worse.
So it really sounds like the real work happens before any statement is made. You've got to get clarity of values, pre-alignment across the teams, and almost rehearsing pressure test scenarios so that when it does happen, everyone is prepared as much as they can be.
Yep.
Just moving on, if we think about aligning brand with purpose, talked a little bit about that today. What does authenticity look like when it comes to purpose, and how can you tell if people will believe it? Sue?
I think that's a really good question. I think authenticity cannot be manufactured. I would say that this is something that has to come from a company perspective. In my experience, I think it's less about elegance of the purpose statement and more about where you're willing to lose. What are the things that you're ready to trade off? So, for example, I can tell you at N26, when we talked about banking for mobile first generation, people believed it when they saw the product decisions, that might have annoyed some traditional, planning and stakeholders. So dropping certain legacy features or, even canceling features that you had rolled out, obsessing over, UX, for example, or, slowing down rollout because of compliance or security concerns. The purpose shows up in the friction, not just in the campaigns.
And culture comes into this too. All these terms kind of interact, but what kind of culture do you have? Is it an open culture? Is it, some of the private companies are a little bit more guarded. They don't like to, be very open, but actions, behaviors, decisions, and repetition. You can't just do it once. You can't just establish something, and then it goes away. That's almost worse than not doing it at all.
Yeah. But how do you stay true to that purpose when commercial pressure shows up, which they inevitably do? Sue?
Yeah, I think, to be honest with you, this is one of the most challenging things for most companies. I think I would say that multiple times, does the purpose fit in? Does this purpose grow from what we already do well? I think this is the most important question. So I would say as a marketing, leader for years, I've had 3 tests. Number one is, that whether this purpose grow from what we already do well. So do our products, our capabilities and history, does it align, or is it just a slogan? Is it just a, slap the slogan kind of a thing that you're doing? And can be connected to a clear business model on how we make money, whom we serve, and what changes in how we operate. And the best test of anything is, most importantly, if you remove the logo from the deck or the story that you're telling, would people really know that this is the company? And that's if the purpose doesn't pass those tests, it's really just a positioning exercise, and I think not really a real purpose. And I think when it comes to commercials, I think end of the day, you get the commercials and the numbers, and unit economics makes sense when you're truly aligned with what you're doing and staying in your lane and not trying to do it all and not trying to jump into topics that don't even relate to you and create a chaos. I think that's the most important test, I think, of all.
Before we wrap up, from everything that we've discussed today, what's the one thing that you would tell a CEO about speaking up on social issues? Sue?
Wow. I have to, there's so many things I can say here. I'm just trying to find, so I think the biggest thing I'll say is that for a CEO is that number one, the first step you need to think is that this is not a campaign, it's a conversation. So you need to really understand that, are you talking about it because you want to have a campaign or a promotion, or are you having a conversation with the people, with the media and others on a meaningful topic that aligns with what you do, the business that you're in, the values that your company is associated with, the people who join this company believing it that, or are you creating a rift within the company by going in directions that will not keep your company alive for long, so I think the biggest thing you need to have is, I would say that, be mindful of what topics you want to take on. Number two, you can have your own personal perspectives. Nobody stops you from having a personal perspective. I often encourage CEOs and founders to talk on topics that they personally feel, but don't make it a company story. I think you need to really be careful and toe the line, whether you're speaking on behalf of the company or whether you're speaking on behalf of yourself. And often founders and CEOs think that they sort of run the company, so there might be a tendency to think that if I believe this is important, because I am the one who created this company, I'm going to go talk about it, or I'm going to spend thousands of dollars, sorry, thousands of millions, or sorry, my bad, like hundreds of millions of dollars or euros on such a campaign, whether it's even worth it, whether it's going to bring the growth to the business, whether it's going to alienate your customers, or whether it's going to make them happy. I think this is a difficult decision. Of course, the CEO wears the hat to be the captain of the ship, so hold that role responsibly when it comes to social issues. I think that would be my number one. So be bold, be brave, talk about the topics that make sense, don't be shy, and number three, be mindful of how you go about with that.
Thank you. Jan?
I would just add another way to look at this that is very consistent with what Sue is saying. Be relevant, be authentic, and be consistent.
Love it. Thank you both. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Let's Talk Global Business. We'll be back next time with a focus on a new topic. Thank you, Sue and Jan, for sharing your insights with us. You can listen to the entire catalogue of this series programming by visiting our website at conference-board.org. And if you're enjoying the series, please consider subscribing so you can stay connected with future discussions. Until next time on Let's Talk Global Business.